All right, so we're gonna get started. My name is Dave Ricardo, and I'm lead with YIMBY Denver, as well as a founder of Nook House, a new ADU builder here in Denver. We sponsored the tech support as well as the chips and soda, so I'm gonna give you a 30-second elevator spiel before we get into the event. We do a rapidly deployable ADU that surpasses any Energy Star standards and uses a variety of passive house techniques. Designs are optimized for the alley-loaded lots that you find throughout Denver. And we provide a spacious garage with an apartment on top, and if you stick solar panels on the roof, it's actually a net negative structure, producing more electricity than that structure needs, offsetting the energy use at the main house that the owner likely lives in. You can find us at nook-house.com. And if you have any questions about ADUs, feel free to ask me after the event. Jumping in, for those who aren't members of YIMBY Denver, we're an organization dedicated to housing abundance here in Denver and the surrounding municipalities. We operate as part of the nationwide YIMBY Acting Network. For anyone who's a fan of housing policy and who loves getting into the nitty-gritty of politics and policy, I highly recommend joining our organization so that you can be part of our extremely active Slack channels. We host great happy hours in addition to running that Slack and hosting educational events like this. Abe is our membership chair. He's right back there. And Ryan, our president, is also here. So without further ado, I will start introducing all of the folks who will be talking about Single Stair with us this evening. So to start, we've got Dick Farley, who is a fellow emeritus with the American Institute of Architects, an urban designer and architect, the former deputy director in charge of urban design at Denver Community Planning and Development, CPD, and the co-chair of the Lodo District Inc. Business-oriented RNO, Registered Neighborhood Organization. They sort of handle local neighborhood politics here in Denver. Next, we have Jeff Evans, who is the founder of Codified Life Safety, a registered architect and a certified building official with decades of experience navigating the regulatory landscape of the built environment. Next, we've got Fred Glick, who is a local developer involved in urban development and community service. He is the current vice chair of the Denver Planning Board and has one of the coolest homes in Denver, and that's per the mayor's office, not according to me. They gave him a design award years ago, and he built 1500 Market Street, which won an AIA National Award, which is pretty uncommon here in town, like pretty much the only one. Next, we have Peter Lafari, who is CEO of Maker Housing Partners, a socially conscious public housing authority based in Adams County. He's the owner, operator, and developer of multifamily affordable housing and a housing policy writer. And finally, we have Sean Jersnick, who is a multifamily architect and a huge single stair advocate. I recommend following him on Twitter. You will see all of the coolest buildings that have only one staircase. He will be presenting for us tonight to start to give us an overview of everything, but he has presented on this subject at state and national conferences, including YIMBY Town 2 weeks ago. His firm, SAR Architects, bought us all of those sandwiches. So yeah, without further ado, you want to get started?
How does the thing come in? Share.
So I'm going to provide you guys with a crash course on single stair housing, also known as point access block housing, also known as the Seattle Special if you're building housing in Seattle. But I'm going to walk through the fundamentals of this type of housing that's pretty unique in the US, but standard in the rest of the world. And the reason it's standard for the rest of the world is that there's a lot of benefits with this housing type. Next slide, please. So I'm talking about single stair housing. It's really a conversation on missing middle housing. And missing middle being housing that's larger than single family homes, like duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, but smaller than large multifamily projects, high rises. And the reason there's not a lot of missing middle housing in the US, one of many reasons, is linked to our building code. In that the fundamental housing forms allowed in our building code, if you're building with a single stair and a small footprint, the maximum height you can build to is 3 stories. If you're building with 2 stairs, you have a much larger footprint, you have an efficient design, but you need a lot of parcels assembled to build a housing project. Next slide, please. So what most of the world does, and what Seattle has found to be an effective housing model, is building a unique building code that allows taller single stair housing with specific safety codes tailored to a mid-rise scale apartment or condo project. And this type of project creates density on small lots, so it allows for fine-grained infill in urban areas. It also unlocks missing middle housing opportunities by creating a variety of unit sizes centered around a single stair core. And then these buildings also have a lot of quality of life, quality of living advantages because they have windows on multiple sides. So when you compare a floor plan of a single stair building against a double stair building, a triple stair building with a double loading corridor, single stair buildings, the units are clustered around a central circulation core, and the floor plans are very efficient. This diagram shows a layout that includes an equal number of beds, but footprints that are vastly different. The single stair footprint is about 1,000 square feet less than the double loaded corridor example to the right. And most of the single stair units have dual aspect. That means they can easily ventilate the space. They get a lot of daylight. Where the double loaded corridor units all have windows on a single side usually. Next. So when looking at the rest of the world, the US is kind of at the bottom of the chain, like the lowest heights allowed for single stair housing, except for a few unique cities that have added amendments to their code, specific amendments and safety provisions that allow for taller single stair housing. And there are amendments that these jurisdictions have found to be safe over the decades that these provisions have been around. Next slide, please. So one of these jurisdictions is Seattle, which has a lot of similarities with communities and neighborhoods in Colorado. Next slide. So what Seattle's done with their building code is they created what is now 14 safety provisions that are unique to single stair buildings up to 6 stories in height. So they limit the number of units on a floor, they require sprinklers, they require stair pressurization. They have a variety of safety requirements that officials have used to make for a pristine exiting condition. In comparison, double loaded corridor buildings have a separate set of rules that apply to very large multifamily housing projects. So what Seattle's done is tailor their code to a specific scale of housing. Next slide. And one thing that comes up a lot in this conversation, which is really important to talk about safety, is Seattle has tailored their building code to be very tight, very restrictive. And this is a great comparison between what's allowed in Seattle at 6 stories and the Grenfell Tower, which was a tower that burned a few years back. It was a terrible disaster. A lot of people lost their lives. And that building was built with a completely different set of safety standards. That building had had 24 stories, had 120 units, no sprinklers. Whereas in Seattle, the largest single stair building that you can construct maxes out at 6 stories in height, 20 units using the stair, along with a long list of other safety provisions. So they're vastly, fundamentally different buildings. Next slide, please. And this is what the emergency egress plan looks like when you are in the corridor of a single stair building in Seattle. It's a very short corridor, and if you're looking for your way out in this building, you just turn around. And there's the stair, there's the rated enclosure you can get into to quickly exit the building. Next. So in looking at Seattle, we found that there's hundreds of these single stair buildings that have been built over the decades. And they've been built in every neighborhood that allows and is zoned for height above 3 stories. And so developers and builders have found all these opportunities to infill, create housing density in existing neighborhoods using this unique code provisions. Next slide. You need to look at a few of what those projects look like in Seattle, and I think these projects are a great example of housing that would fit great into neighborhoods and communities in Colorado. This project, it's only 4 stories in height with parking in the basement, and it has a range of unit types: 1 bed, 2 bed, and 3 bed units, 6 units total, on the same street as townhomes, single-family homes. Next slide, please. This project is a condo project that has 8 units. It's also on a diverse street. It's next to an apartment building. You can see there on the right, it's 6 stories high. On the other side is a neighboring property that's a single-family home. And this project has 8 units. All the units have windows and daylight on multiple sides. And there are home ownership opportunities on this very small urban lot. Next slide. This Jensen Court project is really neat because it's on the same lot as an existing 100-year-old home. It's a lot that's only 30 feet wide. And wherever David went, I think you should look at this ADU model for putting 10 units on a lot of an existing homes. Big time. But these units, the quality of these units is great because there's no shared walls. The stair serves as a separation between the units on each floor. So you don't have any walls that are shared with neighbors, any noisy neighbors that are next door. And then you also get daylight on 3 sides of the unit. Next slide. This project is a great mixed-use project. That the bottom floor is a preschool. The 3 floors above each have 4 2-bed units. I think a project of this scale would fit really well in Fort Collins or Colorado Springs. And it'd be an opportunity for a family to live in the upper floors and send their child to preschool, the ground floor. Next slide. This Capitol View project is another great one, and it was built by Habitat for Humanity. It's a narrow 40-foot lot, and they've added 13 units to this lot. So 13 home ownership opportunities in Capitol Hill in Seattle, a range of unit sizes, 1 through 3 beds. And Habitat has found this to be so successful that they're also developing another single stair project a few blocks away that's going to be completed later this year. Next slide. This is the last project that I'll share with you. This is a project that's under construction right now. It's an adaptive reuse project where they've preserved a 100-year-old brick storefront building and integrated a single stair apartment building into it with 22 units and really activate this corner lot. And I think something like this would work really well on Colfax in Denver. Next slide. So the last slides that I'll finish with here, taking a look at what this type of housing would look like in Colorado, in a neighborhood in Denver. This is 2 blocks in Capitol Hill. And me and my coworkers took 8 of the single stair buildings that we just looked at, put them on underutilized lots in Cap Hill, where there's currently parking. And we also used 2 single family lots as well. And we added, 8 single stair buildings, which adds up to 100 units. And these buildings are hard to spot in this aerial rendering. They're in black and white, but they're hard to spot because they fit with the existing scale and character of the neighborhood. They fit on the same street that has single family homes, townhomes, large apartments. Next slide. So these are where the projects are that we dropped under these lots, and we used a variety of different housing types from the precedents that I just showed you. And it shows how right now, under existing zoning in the city, that we can have housing options if we simply amend the building code. Density is already encouraged, and housing opportunities like this can exist if we wanted. So that's kind of my segment, and I'm showing you what it looked like in Colorado with single stair housing. I'll hand it over to Peter.
Thanks, Sean. Good to see everybody. As was shared, I'm Peter Bakari, and I'll share just real quickly how I came to find single stair. I've shared this with a couple folks in the room, and Representative Valdez when we first started talking about the bill. But I was presenting to Leadership Denver about 2 years ago on LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits, the housing deficit, why we are where we are, and the built environment. And this very courageous woman stood up and said, well, you know, Peter, I can tell every tax credit building in the city. I live in one. I hate it. We're being warehoused. My family doesn't fit comfortably in the units, and I only face north. And after I got my breath back and I realized I needed to listen to this brave woman and her truth. And that really led me on an exploration of not just social housing across the world, but really about how to improve the built environment. Met Michael Ice and many others here today through that journey. And so, you know, I think it's important to understand that although I'm very proud of the double loaded corridor buildings that I develop, and my colleagues and maybe some folks in the room as well, but there are significant trade-offs that single stair buildings don't require of us, that could create a built environment that is conducive to thriving family lives, thriving happiness in an urban dense environment. And so I want to kick it off. You know, Sean mentioned a number of the benefits of a single stair code. And so I want to ask the panel, like, what drew you first to single stair, and what excites you the most? And perhaps we can start over with Richard, if you want to start. Dick.
I'm afraid I've answered to that for about 80 years or so. Well, I think it's the scale that really attracts me to the single stair model. The fact that it can scale to a neighborhood, it can scale to corridors. There are, for instance, a Colfax corridor, either on the east side or the west side. There's so many small lots, 75 wide lots, that you can just get a used car lot onto, and that's about it. And this building type has the ability and the scale, I think, to take advantage of that lot, to fit next to a corridor and to relate to everything.
Fred, you're a developer. How do you envision deploying this should you be allowed legally to create a single stair community?
Well, I got interested because I'm very interested in how difficult it is to make small buildings, whether that's. It says it's on. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good, okay, I'll try and project a little better. I'm very interested in the hurdles that we find before us in terms of building small buildings and making small buildings, whether we're talking residential or commercial. Our code right now is really designed to make big buildings, and that, to me, becomes a very much a challenging urban design question. And if you're out there reading Denver Fugly, which I'm not allowed to anymore, I was banned. But people complain about the greedy developers building only these giant buildings, and there's a reason that that's what people are building. Because that's what pencils out, and that's how our code is structured. So I think that it's not what people want to see necessarily in their neighborhoods, and so that what Dick talks about with the scale, but I think it also starts to unlock lots that really aren't developable for much right now. I was in Cap Hill with a broker friend who'd been asked to put a value on a property for an owner. And it was a 9,000 square foot corner lot in Cap Hill with 5-story zoning. And he and I looked at each other and we said, well, 3, maybe 4 townhouses. And so this is a way of taking those parcels that don't have much potential now, but we zoned it so it has potential, right? And unlocking some of that potential. I think people think that zoning is going to solve it, and if we zone it that way, they'll build it that way. But if it's not feasible to build 5 or 6 stories on a lot, even though the zoning's there, it's not going to happen. So that, to me, is what's very interesting about this, is starting to look at our neighborhoods where that zoning is already in place and unlocking mid-block parcels, for example, that, okay, it's a duplex, well, or it could be 22 units. But it's a substantial difference to me.
So are you hearing anything from clients at the firm that this is an application they would desire and explore? Or is it more of a, kind of a beloved insider baseball thing to a architects?
So we've had a lot of great conversations with different developers that see the potential in something like this. One developer in particular has a lot next to transit in Denver and thinks small lot could really be unlocked with single stair housing at density, access to transit, and help activate the neighborhood. So that's exciting to hear that kind of feedback.
Thank you. So Jeff, are we all gonna die in these buildings? You're a safety expert, fire safety expert, years of experience. Can you talk, like, what does the evidence demonstrate as to the safety of these buildings? And what can you share with the audience today in reference to that?
That's a good question. First, thank you. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me out and wanting to be here, and Sean and SAR architects for my connection. So I want to say thank you for the invitation. When I first heard of the concept as a code person, I did think it was dangerous. And my first exposure to it was just through my readings of popular literature. I can't remember, it was not a genre or a trade specific journal. But as a code person, I looked at it and I read all of the justification, the agenda, all of the aspects about this that were positive. And I recognized it as an agenda. But what I perceived was a shadow of true technical understanding of why we have the codes that we have. And between then and now, I have come to understand that this is a very safe design. One of the things that we're lacking right now is hard empirical evidence. We don't have a way, or have not yet, to my understanding, quantified that this is safe. And I think that that's an obstacle to moving this forward. It's important to understand that when I did read this for the first time, or get exposed to it, my gut reaction was as I described. And I think it's important to understand that that mindset is ubiquitous amongst those who are in charge of enforcing the code and in charge of developing the code. And the conversation that we've been having is largely centered around all of the innumerable and tangible real benefits that this building type provides. But we're not yet really at a point where we can bring this into a conversation that's gonna change the code. Everybody agrees that's on the right side of this conversation, that it makes sense. But we don't have right now in place a good mechanism to push this forward because the roadblocks are the code officials that are gonna be meeting empirical evidence. Anecdotally, as Sean said, this building type has existed successfully outside of the United States for decades. And similarly in Seattle for decades, similarly in New York. So I believe, and in the fire protection engineering community that I work with and collaborate with, we have developed designs that meet a level of safety that is acceptable. But we have some obstacles to get it adopted on a broad basis. So I think it's gonna work.
So Joe, some of the things we've heard from, straight men and women in the fire safety world profession is that, that we need to be thinking about apparatus availability. Can you chat a little bit about your thoughts about, how proponents of a single stair can, kind of connect and speak the language of code officials to be able to get that ubiquitous thought process, kind of addressed, right? Because, right, folks have been saying like, it's a risk that we're just really afraid to take. Maybe we believe the data, we've seen data, some data, it's not as readily available, but what we see is that these buildings are equal to, if not safer, right, in other countries. And so what are some of the ways that we can connect with them, be able to understand them, and then provide education and support around the elements that would go into being able to accept this code?
It's a really hard one. It's a hard question to answer. Because when you look at how code is developed, it's a very mysterious process. We could spend a couple hours talking about that process and compare it to similar processes, parallel processes. How do we develop a regulatory environment for our aviation industry, for example? Places where people occupy, maritime, railroading, aviation. These are several examples. Automobiles, Federal Traffic Highway Safety Administration. The way building codes are developed are very different from that. So to really answer this question, what is the magic? What's going to be the element that we need to focus on? How do we construct a conversation? How do we deliver this? How do we create a compelling argument in favor of? Is the question I think we need to spend the time on. Because it's very obvious what social and civic benefits there are to this building type and how that trickles down to economics and human welfare on the broadest scale. But how do we how do we work within this apparatus of code development to get this adopted? How do we educate? One of the challenges that we have in this is that the other things that have had success being adopted in the code, mass timber, for example, that is something that has a financial model, an economic model behind it. There are industry organizations that stand to benefit tremendously economically. They collaborate, they work together, they work in union, they spend lots of money to lobby. The process of code development is a heavily lobby intensive thing. And we don't have an American Wood Products Association pushing this. We have developers with individual interests, but we don't have an advocate that has the backing of an industry sector like wood does. And I think that where we don't have that, what we need to use to advocate for that is really the legislative process. So I think instead of having private industry push this based on the resources that they can muster from an economic perspective and their lobbying perspective, so we don't have that. We need our elected officials to bring this to the forefront and to a certain extent mandate that this be considered. Otherwise, we just don't have a loud enough voice or a strong enough tool to compel code officials. Every time we bring this up to code officials, we were met with instant resistance. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it, the majority of it's cultural. But we also don't really have a mechanism of accountability where we get to say, why are you saying no? What's your basis for that? And do we have an end around to be able to have this conversation where we can look at this on an evidence-based, a science-based perspective? So I think we need legislative advocacy. And I think we just need to participate in an education campaign so that the concept of point access is not a foreign term.
Well, I appreciate it, Tip. I mean, we're honored to have Representative Valdez here who's doing just that, alongside his co-sponsor, Senator Priola, and we're gonna hear from Alex later today. We've also heard from fire safety professionals that, oh, a statewide building code wouldn't be a bad thing either in reference to this. And so it's a whole other can of worms that we can open up another legislative session perhaps, but thank you for that. I want to talk about the built environment and how these buildings are going to influence said environment. I can start with Fred and then go to Dick, but what's the process for bringing this to life in Denver? Can it happen? Does it have to be triggered by the legislature in 1239, or can it happen on its own volition concurrently perhaps? Talk to us a bit how it will be applied.
Well, I'm optimistic that we're gonna see some movement on this in Denver. We did have a meeting with officials a couple of weeks ago and got an indication from them that they could see this in the next code amendment package that will be approved in 2025. And that was building official and the fire chief who oversees the building stuff. So that gave me some real optimism, and the code is the basis of it. There are other pieces that are going to need to be a part of that. I think we're going to need to tune some pieces in the zoning code to help enable it. Our zoning code, like our building code, is kind of assumes large buildings. So we have, in many cases, upper story setbacks or mass reduction in upper stories that is required. And when we're talking about building on a narrow lot and talking about having to be back, 15, 20 feet or something, depending on what it says, from the side interior lot lines, on a narrow lot, that doesn't leave a whole lot of building. So I think we're going to need to do some tuning to the zoning code as well. And I think it's a real opportunity, because I think we've seen where people are trying to make some small buildings or utilize small and sometimes unusual lots in Denver. We've seen what that zoning code does. And the one example would be the Burrell down in Rhino, which is getting close to CO, that is fully affordable condos. And they lost, it's a weird little triangular shaped lot. And because of how the zoning code works there, they had to, it'll pull off of the point of the triangle. And they lost, I think, either 5 or 6 fully affordable condos in a city with a fair housing crunch. And they tried to fight it. And, basically the response was, yeah, we realize it's not the right answer, but this is what the code says, our hands are tied on this. So my hope is that as we start to consider single stair, as we translate that into the zoning code, that we can really look and say, okay, these are small buildings. Is that a little bit different from building the cruise ship multifamily apartments that we're so used to seeing built? And can we also talk about that in other circumstances that may or may not be single stair buildings, but are smaller buildings? Because I think, frankly, that triangle point of that building in Rhino, building it out to the point was arguably, I think, a better urban design solution. That the code said, no, you can't do that.
Well, I think that the zoning code, kind of suffers from the fact that you can't, it's not very flexible. You know, we've, I think, erred on the side of predictability. So everything is labeled, everything is, you know, figured out, you know, there's, you know, the horrible thought of somebody sort of taking advantage of some loophole in the ordinances, produced an ordinance that have hardly any loopholes, but on the other hand, it doesn't have, it spells out everything. So, you know, I think that's a different issue, obviously, but still it affects, you know, new building types like this. You know, Fred said that there's, you know, upper step backs required. Well, that's part of the, you know, I was looking at the Colfax zoning and the new, the recent Colfax, you know, planning efforts for those neighborhoods. And there's Colfax has lots of great opportunities. If you want to have density along that, if you get a BRT going there, then it's absolutely the right place to have small densities like that. But within, you know, a lot away from Colfax, you have these low density neighborhoods, single family units, neighborhoods, and that they are protected districts. And so against a protected district, you've got to do all these setbacks. There ought to be some way in which you have exceptions to that, or there ought to be, you know, the code that builds in incentives for affordable housing. There ought to be ways in which the incentives can be broadened for small fortnight developments and buildings. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done with the zoning ordinance, you know, let alone the building code.
Thanks, Dick. Sean, from an architect's perspective, how does this question apply to you?
An exciting question as an architect, because that's what we do, is get paid to think of opportunities and the potential. And so in talking about the single stair topic, it's a great opportunity to bring other people into the conversation, talk about opportunities that can be created around Colorado. Lots of different housing types that we could have here, co-housing or battle group in, glad you brought that article, question for that. Excellent. I was thinking about the idea that you make these trade-offs, right? Like we had this idea of like a big dumb box, right? And how like simplicity is elegance, but yeah, we've kind of, you know, forced that out of the code in pursuit of, you know, that box that they just described. I mean, do you envision this creating, you know, more elegant buildings that, you know, have greater, you know, efficiencies that unfortunately you're not able to retain in your current paradigm? Absolutely. I think there's potential for more efficient buildings. We work with engineers that see the potential in a stacking single stair building and modifying plumbing systems to reuse gray water and analyzing costs on some buildings to find that they could do a gray water reuse system for no added cost type thing.
I mean, that's great. I mean, like, let's talk about cost of construction. This is another, you know, vital element. Like, there's been much discussed about how this can bring down costs plus or minus 20%. I think, you know, I'm interested, Fred, what do you think? Like, how does this help with pencil out projects? You talk a bit about cost.
Sure, you know, I don't think we've done enough work here to really get into it, but we've seen numbers from elsewhere where on the surface, there's some real expenses to these, because we're not talking about stick-built stuff, we're talking about pressurized stair, but we're also talking about a much more efficient floor plate. So suddenly you know, on one hand, it looks more expensive, you look at the price tag, on the other hand, you start looking at the price per square foot and you start thinking, Oh, okay, actually, that might make some sense. I think what, you know, it's pretty clear that Habitat's figured it out in Seattle. They built a bunch of these, so there's gotta be a path to it. I think one of the things that's interesting about the form is that this is a tool that clearly can be applied to a number of different circumstances economically. So we've seen in Seattle some great habitat construction. And there's also some pretty cool high-end luxury stuff. So clearly it's got the ability to span between those, depending on how you're using it. And I think, of course, from a cost perspective, one of the things in my mind that this has a real advantage is those lots that everybody's been looking at and saying, well, I could build a duplex there. Suddenly, if you can build 20 units there, your land cost calculation starts to get a little bit different. And I think that's pretty interesting. It also I suspect, and I'm not really an economist, but I suspect from a supply and demand standpoint, you know, we've got very limited places right now in Denver where you can build multifamily because of the scale of building that you need to do. You know, you want a block face. If we could do this, suddenly that opens up a lot of land that nobody had been thinking about this and thinking about in terms of for multifamily. So I have to believe that from you know, suddenly the supply is going to grow considerably. So one would hope that that means that the land costs aren't suddenly going to jump and, oh, well, you know, that little plot. Yeah, so suddenly that's worth $600 a square foot for the dirt. Hopefully that won't happen because we've got so many opportunities to do these now.
Dick, do you have any thoughts on cost and applicant? Do we have questions? Oh, perfect, wonderful.
How are they doing it in Seattle? Has anybody gone up there and thoroughly examined that question? I mean, how are they doing?
Sean, you took a road trip. Well, you had a trip.
We did take a field trip to Seattle. I met with architects and developers. And these types of projects are prevalent all over the city, lots of different project types, like Fred mentioned, the potential for student housing, luxury condos. So it's something that a variety of developers are working on. And I think it expands the potential pool of developers for building multifamily housing. That a developer, maybe that's not suited to build a large double-loaded corridor project that has 100 units, might be able to get in and start with a 20-unit project. So there's probably a larger pool to pull from. And then they're also then pulling up, you know, contractors, carpenters on the job. In addition to that, all these projects that I showed today had different architects working on them. So they're a range of developers, a range of architects and contractors working on all these projects, and they're teams that aren't suited to just doing large projects all the time.
It sounds to me like there's a lot of pathways in Seattle. And if I was buying the ticket, I'd go to Seattle. You know, it's best to see something that's been done. And then go talk to the people who did it, you know, talk to the city who let it get built. So there's a lot of information there, and just from what I see.
Yeah, happening in Honolulu as well, somewhat as well in New York City. Those are two other jurisdictions where the code exists in varying, different, with some variances. But, you know, I think what another question is, and we could talk about affordability, we started to talk about this, and please, if there's questions, jump in. We also have time at the end for Q&A. But, you know, I think what we're seeing a lot of questions is right now, you have standard 3-story walk-up, which is bread and butter affordable housing development outside of the dense urban cores. One of the solutions that I provide at Maker and other housing authorities in the greater Front Range is, you know, you start looking at how you point access block stack these, right? And so, you know, without some adjustments to code and some of the things we think might happen through the legislative process, if you're limited to only 20 units in one building, that's going to be difficult to pencil out in a LIHTC environment, low-income housing tax credit environment. But if we can get to 40 units, and between 40 and 60 units, using a very similar approach as our three-story walk-up in our suburbs, this becomes very viable. Right, so the application then becomes scale, which drives the underwriting for the bread and butter affordable housing equity vehicle, which is the low-income housing tax credit. So it's going to really vary depending upon jurisdiction and how they adopt their code and what they adopt it as how they adopt it as. But ultimately, there are applications that we can see. And Habitat here in Denver is developing condos. They're just townhomes. And so we've been in deep conversations with the local chapter. Really, we have to start looking at how insurance responds to this. We think there'll be very favorable insurance underwriting elements to this because of all the additional incremental safety elements that Sean talked about and Jeff talked about a moment earlier. But I think Prop 123, it's really about subsidies when it comes to affordable housing. I think what we see, the first pancake out of the pan is going to be the upper quintile. And depending upon if we do not have local governments make this too onerous and muck it up too much, it's a very straightforward middle income application here. This is a bread and butter missing middle product type, as Sean led off in his presentation. The question then becomes, okay, how can we drive subsidy? Habitat needs about $175,000 a door right now in Denver to be able to pencil out one of their builds. And so affordable housing assets developers, because we use LIHTC, we need about 35 to 45K a door. That's not a hit. We're not selling these assets. It's just a different pro forma. But at the end of the day, Prop 123 and its 300 million and counting and land banking should help offset some of the land basis dynamics that Fred mentioned. So it really comes down to, oh, by the way, Denver also has a minimum bond, which is outside of Boulder, the only real gap financing at the local level from a dedicated taxation measure that we can see driving down a per unit cost based off of a per unit subsidy. And so we'll see places like Boulder, places like Denver, perhaps some of the high country locations that have a taxation measure based off of, and like in Summit County as an example, with their occupancy fee. So essentially, I think those are the areas if we looked at where we could forecast these buildings coming out of the ground first, and then whether or not those buildings are affordable on the front end. Yes.
You know, I'm not an architect or a code person or a developer. So I don't understand what are the reasons why the code won't allow? What is the safety reason? Is it because you'll have more exits for the inhabitants? Or what are the reasons why we have a code that says you can't do a single store?
I think what happened is most of our code is built out of the early 1900s, different fire safety environment, some tragedies. Jeff, you'll be able to illuminate that much better than me.
Yeah,
This park is full of these.
they do.
My daughter lives in one.
That's right, that's
I
right.
see too.
There's when you look at this, from that perspective, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. It's hard to reconcile why this is permitted in Seattle and Honolulu and New York and why there's resistance to it elsewhere. But when you start to peel back the layers, you start to uncover how code gets developed. We can spend a lot of time talking about it, but in general terms, the way our code, the built environment in this country is regulated, is very reactive. Codes developed early in the century, generally from insurance companies, and then evolved to be something that government took over. But codes don't typically change unless there's some event, some tragedy, where there's injury or loss of life or property. And so the codes examine what the causes of that were, and then something gets implemented to mitigate that. And so we've got this boa constrictor process of the code responding to these things happening. And it's a one-directional thing. Subsequent to a lot of these things that are in the code, like the requirement for 2 exits. Why do we have 2 exits? Well, if one gets blocked by a fire, we want to have some redundancy. And that makes sense, right? That's a reasonable thing to require, is some enhanced reliability. But when that was introduced in the code, technology has advanced to a point where where we now build buildings very differently from the way buildings were built when that became an important imperative. So we've got fire resistance rated construction now, we've got systems now, active systems, fire sprinklers, fire alarm systems, mechanical systems like stair pressurization and smoke-proof enclosures that now provide incredible degrees, orders of magnitude safer than one of the problems we have about finding quantitative data on the safety of point access blocks is, you know, how many people are dying in these things? How many people are getting injured? How many people are getting trapped? How many times do we have conflict within stairs or fire responders conflicting with the people egressing the building? You just don't have enough data because these buildings are largely sprinklered, and that's been creating effective safety. So it's an obsolete code requirement, basically, is the short answer to your question after I spent.
And then just the bureaucracy too around like the IBC, right? And how the fact that really only Canada and the United States use a non-governmental entity, right? So could you just share a little bit about the uniqueness of the IBC compared to the rest of the world and how they go about their code?
I can talk much more expertly on how codes get developed here. The IBC, if you've heard of that, the International Building Code, is prescriptive.
Not quite internationally applied.
Not quite internationally applied. They have aspirations and they project it. The code is developed by the International Code Council. They're a nonprofit organization, sort of. And they project their organization as one who develops the code through a consensus process, sort of. Every 3 years, there's a new version of the code that comes out, and there's a process by which people can make recommendations for code changes. But one of the interesting things, and I think this is super important to know, if you're not in the know, and even a lot of people who use this book and are subject to the provisions of these books, are that anybody can make a proposed code change. Anybody can debate the positives and negatives of the code change. There are committees that are formed of design professionals, architects, engineers, people with special interests. And then there's a whole community of code officials, so the inspectors, the plan reviewers, the administrators. The only people that are authorized in this process to vote on a code change are code officials. I, with whatever decades of experience in this, can't vote. I'm in private practice. I'm not a code official. I don't work for government. And those are that's the only population, the only demographic that actually gets to vote on the code. And so we don't really, in spite of the fact that they claim that there's a consensus process, up to the point where we vote, it's kind of consensus. But the actual process of saying, yes, we're going to approve this is limited to that small demographic. And they bring a very different perspective to the code than the community involved in developing the community. And I think that's an obstacle, right? It silences very important voices that have valuable expertise to advance the code development process. It's very unique. I don't know of another regulatory environment where that's the case. An analogy would be when we develop automobiles, we have physicists, we have mechanical engineers, we have chemists, all developing these things, but then only allowing traffic cops to vote on how cars get designed, right? That's kind of the analogy where we've got here in the built environment, and certainly that traffic cop brings expertise to the conversation. But we need the physicists, we need the people that understand how things happen in a crash and all the dynamics. We don't really have that happening in code development process.
Thanks, Joe. Any other questions? Yes.
Just a couple questions. First, a simple one. It was mentioned that this can't be done with stick construction. I'm not in the building trades. Can you mention why that would be? What I heard was up to 5 stories, generally you can, but there's something about this you're saying it can't.
In Seattle, all the projects that I showed are stick construction.
Okay.
They were built under Seattle's and the IBC building code and restrictions on building height related to wood construction. So that,
Yeah, Fred's
One
Fred's
clarification.
dreaming about like in the future when we get above 6 stories, you start
Sure.
moving into steel. And the real true, unlimited possibilities once we can start to get some height on these buildings.
Well, that's certainly important for affordability. The other question I have, and this may be for someone with building or building official experience. In addition to the push and pull between the building code and zoning code, we also have, and this was just briefly mentioned before, the fire safety. And both in our buildings and on our streets, we have suboptimal outcomes, right? You know, dangerous streets and buildings that can't house as many people as they might, because even though in this case, the building code might allow something, the zoning code might allow something, I've heard of instances where the fire department comes in and says, well, you can't, because we don't have the equipment. A brief mention was made of equipment. So what do we know about what happened in Seattle, and how do we navigate this other dimension? I appreciate, Fred, that you reached out very early to them, but how do we navigate this dimension so you don't have a rug pull late in the game where you think you're doing everything right and the fire department says no?
I'll start real quick. So Representative Valdez is engaged a very thorough stakeholdering with fire safety professionals. And part of the conversation is these apparatuses exist. They exist across our cities and counties in the Front Range, especially our most populous cities and counties. But and as we know that buildings will take time to come online through the process, that there would be a necessity for local fire safety, local firehouses to have to bring additional apparatuses online, perhaps in the distant future. There is reciprocity agreements, and the representative can talk to this when it comes up in a minute, but right now between fire districts where they can respond. And so they're thinking very much about this, to your point. What we find, right, Sean, in Seattle, if you want to talk to this, is that because this has been on the books for so long, they've budgeted for the amount of fire apparatuses they believe are required to meet their response times. And so what we've heard from the fire safety professionals in our conversations is that, we think we have enough apparatuses generally. We're really more concerned about, and we think that the fire safety elements that you're showing us, as we show them Seattle, we show them Honolulu, we show them some of the safety outcomes that Sean had in his presentation. But there's always the omnipresent human element, right? That somebody's going to fall asleep smoking. Someone's going to place a couch with flammable material too close to an electrical outlet. They're concerned about that. But I think really what it comes down also access and availability of fire hydrants. Again, not a real big concern in Denver Metro. And so through the process really is the bill empowers local governments to create a single stair code addendum to their existing building code that meets the unique needs of their local government and their fire safety professionals' ability to respond to fires in the time frame that is required. And so I think what we'll see is that as the process plays out, is local governments will build that into their code, and we contemplate that to be included with potentially technical support from the Division of Local Governments and the Division of Housing. And so ultimately what we see here is that, again, because we're a local control state and we do not have a statewide building code, there will be variances, and that was also an element of that. And so again, when we look at some of those same impediments to having zoning reforms at scale, so we can drive economies of scale, building code is inhibited by efficiency gains by our local control construct as well. That doesn't mean that I'm impugning local control. I'm just saying when it comes to zoning and it comes to building codes, it provides exponential risk because of the exponential complexity of having 64 different building codes, one for each county, and hundreds of different zoning codes and building codes for each local government. So it will be an iterative process, and it will be driven by local government's needs.
To add to Peter's response as well, and the incremental responses. So what Seattle's done over time is they initiated this code amendment in the 70s And they enlisted the building department, fire officials to come together and find consensus and write what they found to be a safe code. They all believe it's safe now, but they've continued over time to evolve that code through the decades. So what exists today is different than what they initially enacted in the 70s, because they've had the attitude over time that buildings have changed, so their attitudes on fire safety are evolving with buildings.
Any other, I want to get Representative Valdez up to speed, but I think one more question if there's one.
Yeah, there's one in the chat by Kate Van Houten. What in the bill prevents builders, many of whom are in support of the bill, I see, from building structures of more than 10 or 20 units, say up to 50 or more, in a 5-story design with only one exit stairway?
Why don't we put that question on hold for a second? And if I could invite Representative Valdez up, I think he'd like to hear directly from him. And then we can come back to that question.
Thank you, can you hear me? I'm Representative Valdez. Thank you for inviting me tonight. I represent this area, actually, downtown Denver, the urban core of the city. So when we talk about housing, and housing innovations that I think we can be doing, when I first saw Single Stair, I was immediately intrigued because I have lived in Denver for the better part of 20 years, ever since I was old enough to get kicked out of the house. And I've lived in many single stair buildings already because these buildings were built before that code. So we have experience with this. Denver has experience with this, and it makes a lot of sense because when you talk about what kind of square footage you're using on each floor for stairwells, if you're doing more than one, and then you talk about the cost of those stairwells, because I don't know, most buildings I've seen, those stairwells are hardened, they use cinder block, they use concrete, they use steel stairways, oftentimes, and they're very expensive, so, I could say I was attracted to this concept right away, and, through Drew Nesmith, who I think is who comes oftentimes, who is an aide up at the Capitol, and then working with Peter, and I've over the years met a lot of different folks in the development space and had never before asked, how do we do more with less? Most of my district was kind of attacked by slot homes in the aughts, right? They put so many of these slot homes into some of the formerly not so dense areas of Denver that there was a real unpopularity with density, and density being done on infill style because of that type of architecture. When I first saw designs for what single stair buildings can be, not only did I notice that, what I know from a technical aspect, that they're more economical, both for the builder and therefore probably for the folks that live in there, but they look better. And one of the things in Denver that I think that we've really lost track of is trying to build with some sort of a mission for what our city is going to be, what it's going to look like, what is our character. And you can say it's a bungalow, you can say it's outdoor space, which I would agree. But most of these box buildings really, we've said, look like Soviet value engineering. So they do. So I'm intrigued by this idea. And so I would just kind of take you quick walk through where we're at today. When we started with kind of this belief that we were going to be the first state to come out and actually put single stair as an acceptable form in the entire state. And what we've learned is that it's going to be most of the entire state, most likely, because we do have to account for some health and safety things. I think as legislators, as folks who really believe in housing, we don't want to be responsible for anything that could be seen as a safety issue. So I am confident that we will continue to work with the fire folks and get to a bill that's good, because they did in Seattle. So what our bill is going to do, just to give you a little bit of reference, because it's been kind of ever changing as we go through this process, is we're essentially going to take that Seattle model code, which is what we believe is the gold standard for single stair, and we're going to host that within DOLA for local governments to then adopt. And then we're going to essentially say you have to adopt this by a certain day. That's the goal. that gives us the ability to let our developers know that their design philosophies can evolve, that they can start to look at this property and they can start to make plans for a few years down the road because we have put into place, or we're starting to by putting into place a framework that opens up the floor for single stair design. So I'm a huge fan. You know, there's a lot of expertise up here. I hope to see you all on the 19th up at the Capitol to talk to the committee about it because you know, being somebody who's relatively new to this concept myself, but a true believer in it already, I think we need to hear from folks that really know. So that would be my plea to you is if you really are knowledgeable on the subject and you think that you can deliver some sort of information to the committee up at the Capitol, please do so. We aren't at the point now where we need folks to start calling the fire folks and put on pressure. I do genuinely believe that we both want the same thing, which is to achieve the ability to do single stair buildings, but also to make sure that those single stair buildings is as safe as they can be. And that's something that I really believe in. So I'm confident in that. So yeah, I think one of the really cool aspects of this bill will be the way that it transforms the way Denver looks. And we are talking, so to give you one more basic, we're talking about 5 stories plus potentially a 1 story of multi-use space on the first floor. So we're looking at basically 6 stories max, frame, stick built, but we heard it briefly mentioned earlier, and I think one of the long-term potential outcomes for single stair buildings will be this kind of manufactured timber, this really strong timber that's like steel that will allow us to actually get more rise with our buildings out of our renewable forestry source. So it's a really cool time to be working on this. I'm excited to be working on it. I don't often, I guess you would say, go into the housing space because it is so fraught with expertise. You know, everyone knows everything about housing when it comes to the Capitol, but the truth is, I'm learning so much about how we can be innovative in housing, and I think that's something that we need to continue to do. I think we're just at a start with single stair legislation, then we need to be looking around the world at other things that have worked for other folks, because we just have so many unique challenges, cost wise, affordability wise, and essentially, or especially I should say, regulatory wise, we're really sometimes fighting an uphill battle, but I'm confident, I'm feeling good. It's a very popular concept within our district, within my district, within our caucus, the Democrat caucus. So I'm excited to deliver this. And so I don't know if I'm supposed to open up for questions. I will turn it back over to somebody else who knows better than I do. But I do appreciate you taking the time and taking interest in this subject, because I do believe it's going to change Denver from an affordability perspective, from an innovation perspective, and God willing, from a architectural and vantage way, because we really want some beautiful buildings that we can say that we were a part of bringing to the reality. So thank you very much.
I'm glad we shared that, because I wasn't quite sure if we were able to share the amendment those coming through negotiations. So you heard it early, which is really a return to what we, as the representative mentioned, was our original intent of the bill. So Sean, I think you're both very happy about this. You know, and I do not believe, I gotta double check, but I don't believe we had an occupancy limit. We do not have an occupancy limit in the amendment. We do have the travel distance, and so I double back on that, but you know, really what we're kind of falling back on is that the bill does not usurp local control in reference to their zone conditions. Right, so if there's a floor area ratio requirement, that is not superseded in the bill, and so there, you know, occupancy and any kind of height setback, all of those things are still going to be on a zoning condition by zoning condition basis based off the local government of note. So I highly doubt that the scenario that the commenter in the chat provided, and thank you for bringing that up, would be permissed based off of my understanding of zoning code conditions, but I can't empirically say no until I take a deeper look. But I don't believe that's the case. Sean. I'm not sure on this amendment.
I mean, if the amendment is similar in nature to Seattle, it would limit the floor plate with the units, and that type of scenario they're describing wouldn't be possible.
Yeah,
So we'll have to,
I'm gonna double check, I did not see that, but, yeah. Yeah,
AIA involved in this, Dick, or do you know?
I'm sure they are. I know that Sean is, the expert on that.
I've been working with their government affairs committee, and we've been reviewing the bill. And they're voting on support of the bill this week, so hopefully when I testify next week, I'll be able to also note the AIA's support, so.
thanks, right behind you.
Yeah, so my understanding is that, most fire deaths actually occur in single family homes, mostly because they don't have, sprinklers and fire safe materials. Should we actually ban this, safe type of home? If the concern is fire safety, it seems like we should, yeah. You should.
Yeah, that's an important point, and one that we've shared with the fire safety professionals. I think that like culturally, right, and R2, as I think, requires sprinklers, and so the bill, has this apply to R2 building types, and so, I think the broader conversation as Jeff shared is, are we speaking the same language? Are we understanding the perceived threats from the fire safety community? The question from the gentleman shared earlier, I think, is very apropos, which is that, just in general, there's a concern about fire safety in multifamily assets. That is not contemplated. I do know in one of my jurisdictions that I operate in Westminster, there was a push a number of years ago, about a decade ago, to require sprinklers in single family homes. It was defeated. It was defeated by a number of interests that felt that it would push the cost of the single family home out of reach, which I think is where you're going, which is why would we apply a sprinkler requirement to assets that may not require them from a life safety outcome. And I think what the answer there is that we have to pick and choose our battles. But thank you for pointing out the differential between fire safety dynamics. Jeff, is there anything you'd like to add to
I
that?
would like to add to that. It's a great question. When we look at the sprinkler, automatic sprinkler protection requirements, that does exist in the International Code Council's book that applies to single family dwellings, the IRC, the International Residential Code. It's in there. But one of the important things to know is that jurisdictions have an option when they see the ICC, International Code Council, develops the code and sells the book. That's their business model. That book then is used by local government. They formally adopt that in whatever legislative process. Cities don't develop a code, counties don't develop a code, states don't. They usually look to this model code body to develop this technical standing, and they adopt it. And then their code officials enforce that code. So the IRC does have that requirement, but when the local government adopts the code, they can tweak it. They can make amendments to it. And the bigger the city is, typically the more they think better of themselves than the people who develop the code, and they have a lot of amendments. Smaller jurisdictions don't tend to make a lot of amendments, but that's one of the concerns about approaching this point access form through the process of national code. If you look to the ICC to incorporate this as a code change, any jurisdiction that adopts that code can very easily just, line item veto it, basically. So I think it's important to have this legislative push that mandates that this be incorporated, adopted.
Well, John, I think, and in the interest of just how the legislature works and kind of horse trading is like, we started out like talking to building code experts, folks, architects, developers, planners, and it was like, look, code adoption, code amendments, code revisions are very complex, they're costly, and even, fairly well capitalized local governments struggle, right, to do that. So please create a model code for us, put it in this legislation so that local governments can adopt it, they can make any tweaks they may desire, but we've given them a significant head start, right? by the way, also let's make it permissive so that we don't poke the local control bear and, you know, get the municipal league, you know, running after us. Kevin, I'll come right back to you.
I would say it's a safe space.
Yeah, and so, but then, you know, oh, okay, we didn't have a place for it to live going forward, you know, and so there was some roadblocks that the representative ran into, which was, okay, we adopt this monocode, but where within the local government can we house it? So we don't have a statewide building code, which the fire safety professionals said, we really need one. I said, yeah, I agree with you, but we don't have a political path forward here, and that's not this bill title. And so, oh, okay, well, we really like the fact that you've created a model code. Can you put that back in there? Well, through that process, and as the representative just shared, which is the first time we shared it publicly, which is great, because we're gonna move through these amendments next week, which is no, DOLA and DOH found a home for it. So in negotiation with the stakeholders, this amendment is going to be introduced to return the code that we created, Stephen Smith, Sean, some assistance from Michael Weiss and others. Jeff, we'd like to invite you to that team. Which was, you know, oh, okay, you know, let's take the best elements that we think are most applicable from Seattle and from Honolulu that would fit the Front Range construct and what we know is true in some of those constraints and opportunities as the panel has shared. So I'm really excited for that. It still looks like it's going to be must do by a certain date, which is a preemption. And so, but the representative said that he's in new conversations with local government stakeholders like CML, CCAT, CCI. And so hopefully that will not scuttle this very important bill, but it remains to be seen. We only have 3 instances of housing as a matter of statewide concern and statewide application in our state. One is a PUD Act of 1974. The one is another Mobile Home Act, I believe in the early 80s. And then just last year with Representative Linstead's banning the outlawing of growth. And so we may see one of any number of the multiple preemptive bills like ADU parking, many of the bills that the YIMBY chapter here is supporting. And we can have new precedents set, but we certainly are hoping Single Stair is added to that list. All right.
It seemed like the Single Stair bill would be almost supercharged if the parking requirements bill were also passed at the same time. Because then you could, I mean, especially for a small property, you wouldn't have to build parking necessarily, and you could also have more space to develop. I guess I just wanted to get some thoughts from maybe some of the developers on the panel about that. I mean, it seemed like it would be a great thing for more supply.
I mean, I'm really focused on Denver. And I would tell you that given some of the changes that have already been made to the zoning code, I think an awful lot of the properties that we're talking about have minimal, if any, parking requirements when it comes to this. As we start looking at the zoning code and as it speaks to exceptions around transit adjacency and how some of that is being interpreted. Some of that, interestingly, there were some compromises made when that code went through at city council. And the interpretations that I'm hearing from staff are pretty liberal on that. So I think, you know, as you talk about neighborhoods like Cap Hill where the BRT is coming, you know, if you've got an improved bus shelter, in some cases, that seems to be enough to say, yeah, there's been transit improvements there. So from a Denver perspective, yeah, it could be broader maybe. But you also, you know, with the affordability stuff, with EHA have some exceptions or have some reductions that are pretty substantial. So on a local level, I look at it and I think, yeah, I mean, if you want to do it with not much parking, I think the reality is that we see an awful lot of buildings that are being built with far more than what the minimum is. And that's just that is a developer by developer decision based on what they think the economics are and what's, you know, what they can get the bank to fund, et cetera.
Yeah, the code right now in Denver has a provision in it, an incentive for affordable housing that that parking is part of that incentive, that it can be reduced, just, if you have affordable housing in the mix. As well as on top of all the transit related stuff. So in Denver, I think that, the bar is being, set lower and lower as far as, parking requirements are concerned. Arapahoe Square area, for instance, which is a big area downtown, which has been rezoned in the last, several years, has no parking requirement.
And then definitely, as we get outside of Denver into the, the outer ring suburbs, absolutely. I also think 1313, right, the transit corridor bill, especially outside of the Denver area. Areas that have been more trepidatious or delayed in applying some of the solutions that that panel just shared. I also think, 106, SB 106, when it comes to ownership. And you and I had a lively conversation the other day on Twitter about 106, that just, why aren't we seeing ownership condos in our state? Right, really across the country, but that's something we had on the panel. I'd rather field questions, but I think a couple of key things here is that if we're going to be able to deliver condos at attainable price points, single stair certainly needs to be part of the mix. Right, we've seen this in Seattle. It certainly has deeper affordability, but then as we move towards more of what can utopia bring, and as we lurch forward to it, it's always out of reach, but at the end of the day, what about bog dropping? What about community development? What about group living, co-ops? And so, I know that's important to NB Denver, it's important to me, it's important to a number of the folks on the panel, but we're seeing that in Seattle too. We're seeing really interesting middle income product because of the single stair and the reduction of occupancy limits, which just sailed through the assembly. And so when you look at occupancy limits and some of the zoning condition reforms, as you mentioned, you put those things together and we have what I believe is a new recipe for the new starter. But we have to figure out how we can propagate an environment where developers feel safe enough to develop any sort of product with an HOA, right? We're seeing a lot of townhome development, but townhomes don't have HOAs, strictly to shield themselves from the liability exposure.
This is more of a, I guess, anecdote than a question, but as I was leaving the office to come to this event, and I work at a infrastructure design firm, where we're working on Colfax plus rapid transit. I was talking to one of my engineer coworkers about like, what is this event? What is single stair? And I was explaining it, and he's like, we have to provide 2 means of egress at the bus station. Because that's city requirement. Well, so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I just.
They have sprinklers.
Walking out of a station, some of these stops are exposed, but no, that's a good point. I think it just goes back to the cultural entrenchment the panel's been discussing, and Jeff has very elegantly illuminated, is that although, it's interesting, right? Like zoning is now, more of a kitchen table conversation, right? And that's in large part to the work in this room and what you guys have done and some of what we do, right? But at the end of the day, building code is still very much, like you talk to folks even in the industry and they're like, what are you saying? So, events like these are getting the word out, and I am gratefully appreciative to be a part of it. Is there, David?
I had a code related anecdote and then a question. I believe last week somebody put forward something to the ICC to legalize single stair for the entire IBC, but they kept it to just type 1, type 2, and type 4 buildings, which for anybody who doesn't know building code backwards and forwards means steel and concrete and mass timber, but no stick frame. And I was wondering, like, from a developer perspective and from you as a code, like, does that seem like something that can pass? And once it does that still seem imminently buildable? Like, taking the conversation outside of just Denver or Colorado, but taking this nationwide, like, is that a fair compromise?
So, and I don't have the code book memorized, but I don't think you can do 6 stories right now. with stick built, you have to be up
You
in,
can't see that one,
in Seattle. Okay.
but you can't.
Okay, so the model IMC doesn't allow it anymore. So we talk about construction types and what stuff is a building made of. And just real quick, it's combustible or not combustible, and it's fire resistance rated or it's not fire resistance rated. And the more combustible, the less fire resistance rating, the more limits we have on how wide a tall a building can be. If you incorporate non-combustibility and high fire resistance rating, you can get to a point where it's unlimited in height. And then there's a spectrum in between. To go to 6 stories, we're not allowed to build out of light wood frame construction already. So we talk about cost. You know, is this gonna be more expensive? Are we gonna have to spend more money on trade-offs, life safety trade-offs, building characteristics and features to make up for what is perceived as a deficiency and redundancy? And the reality is not really. When we do 6 stories, we're already not able to build out of light wood frame construction. So we're not really adding too much cost there. When we talk about sprinklers are already required for 3-story residential. This isn't gonna necessarily be an added cost. We talk about, somebody had mentioned, stair pressurization. So one of the things about having only one exit is, well, we want that exit to be kind of smoke-free. We want it to be reliable. We don't want a fire outside of that to affect our ability to get to that stair and go down that stair. And so we want to keep that environment within that stair free of smoke. So there's provisions in it that make it a smoke-free enclosure. One of the ways to do that is with a mechanical system that pressurizes it with air, and that works, but it's a system that costs a lot of money up front. And then there are annual costs to inspect and test and maintain this stuff. ITM is an ongoing ownership cost that's a big burden. But there are passive alternatives to achieve that as well. And I would also say, you know, is it feasible or is it a practical thing? I think we just look around at the built environment outside of our border and Canada's borders, and in those places where it has been done here for decades. And, you know, that's a great case study. We've got ample case studies to look at this and examine. Is there a business model that supports this? Yes. Is there a history of success with regard to life safety? Arguably, yes. We're in the process of quantifying that. Stephen Smith is working on analyzing data so we can have really hard numbers to show that this form is in at least an equivalency, if not more. Is that?
I think that, you know, that it's gonna be interesting, and I'd like to see this happen with whatever we can get at this stage, because I think it'll be somewhat iterative. And light wood construction is gonna make affordable product much more viable. But I also think this form has a huge number of applications. I mean, you know, they're a lot more livable than a typical double-loaded corridor. I mean, what it allows and the feeling, and suddenly, gosh, there's windows not just at the end. It's something that I think as we start to see it happen, that people will say, oh, I could actually see myself living here long term. I mean, right now, we do these double-loaded corridors, and it's like a hotel room. And it feels like that, and it's always gonna feel like that. You start this, and I stayed in one in Berlin last year. It was an apartment hotel that was 6 stories with 5 units per floor, concrete construction, balconies. It was great. I thought, you know, I can live here. It doesn't feel like a hotel room. It doesn't have that basic form, and, you know, the hallway suddenly feels a lot better because I'm not staring down at this, you know, 75-foot long dark hallway. That I have friends who deliver for DoorDash and like post these hallways of doom that they and it's not very nice. So I think regardless of what we can get as a start, I think people will start to see the benefits of it, and we can work towards what else we can do with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Steven said he thinks it's a bit of a long shot. I think you can hear that tangent or kind of teeing that one up. I think also too, you know, CapEx needs moving forward, right? Like you know, like I just experienced at one of my tax credit developments, a 3-month delay on an elevator. Right, because, you know, and various other issues, so, you know, eliminating one elevator is very attractive from an operating cost perspective. And also livability, right? And I think, you know, one of the other elements we haven't discussed is some interesting, especially group living and co-op dynamics, really interesting dynamics when it comes to reducing loneliness. There's some studies coming out of the UK that, you know, I think are important as part of this discussion when we look at positive externalities and how those positive externalities that differ from double loaded quarters could translate into avoidance costs, both for the operator from a CapEx perspective, but most importantly, from a health and wellness perspective for the occupants, for the folks that actually make them homes. Yeah.
I think your mention of an elevator just made me wonder, this excuse me, I forgot the single stair, 6 stories, are those buildings in Seattle, they tend to have an elevator, or are these like 6-story walk-ups, or?
The Seattle projects tend to have an elevator because they're not changing the accessibility code. The accessibility code is usually driving the inclusion of an elevator once you get above a certain height.
I think to Fred's point, you know, that'll be a developer decision too, if it's an amenity that they want to promote to a target demographic and audience, we'll see them, but yeah. Yeah.
A sustainability comment, I guess, if we think back to the aerial image in the presentation of the Denver block where the 8 or so projects were infilled. You know, when you compare to a large double loaded corridor development, which might soak up 4 or 5 lots. And, you know, a parking lot site on either end with 3 very viable buildings in between. I think we all can agree that the most sustainable building is the one that already exists, right? That you don't have to build. And so I think part of this is the more of those structures that we can maintain rather than demolish. Is this another layer to all of us?
Yeah, I'd like to come on that because one of the sort of characteristics that plans, in Denver plans are stressing, is displacement. You know, avoiding displacement. And there are a number of neighborhoods that, you know, are affected by displacement. And what you're talking about is minimizing displacement by maintaining the, you know, the fabric we've got already.
Yeah, important point. It's just Sean, because Sean and I gave an interview to a press outlet a week or so back, and we were actually off Colfax, standing right next to a large double loaded corridor project, and then across the street was the condition exactly as you described. And Sean was discussing with the reporter how, you know, we could deduct that there's a high probability that the lot that the double loaded corridor development is going in looked exactly like the other side of the street that we were talking on. And you just think about those economies of scale, the disruption, you know, how that fits in with the neighborhood. I think, you know, again, and Fred hit on this just briefly, and just about, you know, how do we make sure that this doesn't become a deleterious driver of gentrification, right? Where, and I think again, like that's an environmental, you know, kind of all of government strategy, and it's going to be highly contingent upon how focused that local government is, because it's not going to be one element, right? Because to the point, if the residual land value skyrockets up because we upzone, you know, there's other areas that we could look to that have done a poor job of that, and then there's other areas that have done a better job.
I mean, the more limited we make it, where you can build multifamily, that just drives those neighborhoods. I mean, we've seen that in Denver, and that's the reality. You can do apartments here, and you know that's where it's going to work, and those land values are that. So, gosh, if we could suddenly do this in areas, suddenly do this in a lot more areas, even just what's zoned currently, but isn't currently viable. I mean, it feels to me like it just has to have a benefit in that sense.
All right, well, thank you. That was a lot of fun. like Representative said, if you're into it, the bill's up in committee, next Tuesday. Reach out to us if you want, our contact information, we can help you guys. I know that the NB team does a lot of engagement at the assembly, so you're in good hands, but if you'd like, we'd love for you to come testify, you can testify remotely. If you're interested in more about this, please let us know. And, yeah, it's just been a pleasure to talk with you tonight. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you. We have one more thing we wanna, our membership, chair, Abe, is gonna come up and, talk a little bit about how you can become a member of, DMV Denver and why you should.
You guys need to check them out.
I think I just stopped recording.